I should have stayed at the gas station. It was one of those small, middle-of-nowhere stops with a flickering neon sign advertising cigarettes and overpriced sodas. I'd asked the guy behind the counter how far it was to the next town, and he just grunted. About 20 miles, give or take. The problem? My phone was dead, and my car battery decided tonight was the perfect time to die too. The guy offered me a tow for $200 cash. I only had 70. So I decided to walk, thinking I'd catch a ride or find somewhere to charge my phone along the way. Big mistake. The road was empty, no passing cars, just endless rows of tall pine trees on both sides. The kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, but oppressive, like the whole world had taken a breath and forgotten to exhale. My feet crunched against the gravel shoulder, but even that sound felt swallowed up by the dark. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, feeling like I was being followed. There was no one there. At least, I hoped not. After an hour or two, I spotted it. The building was perched on a small hill, barely visible under the dim light of the crescent moon. A long gravel driveway snaked up to it, framed by wrought iron gates hanging slightly ajar. The place was huge, 3 stories, maybe 4, with a slanted roof and peeling white paint that looked gray in the night. The sign near the entrance read, Hollow Pines Funeral Home, in faded lettering. It didn't look like anyone had been there in decades, but a faint light glowed from one of the upper windows. Relief washed over me. Maybe someone lived there after all. Maybe they had a phone, or jumper cables. I hesitated at the gate, though. Something about the place felt off. The air seemed colder here, like stepping into the shadow of a storm. The wrought iron bars were twisted into strange shapes, almost like faces screaming silently. But I told myself I was just tired, overthinking. It was either this or freezing my ass off by the side of the road all night. I pushed the gate open. The hinges groaned loud enough to make me flinch. Gravel crunched under my boots as I made my way up the driveway, past rows of overgrown bushes and dead trees. The whole place reeked faintly of mildew and something sour I couldn't place. When I reached the porch, I knocked on the heavy oak door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. The sound echoed unnaturally like the wood was hollow. Still nothing. "Hello?" I called out, cupping my hands around my mouth. My voice sounded weak, swallowed by the darkness around me. The light in the upstairs window flickered once, then went out. That should have been my cue to leave, but I was too cold, tired, and desperate to care. I twisted the doorknob, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black hallway that smelled like damp earth and something metallic. Rust? Blood? I couldn't tell. "Hello?" I called again, stepping inside. My voice echoed down the hallway, bouncing off walls I couldn't see. No response. I dug a flashlight out of my backpack and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating a long, narrow corridor with faded wallpaper peeling in strips. Picture frames lined the walls, but the images inside were smudged and water-damaged, the faces blurred beyond recognition. The air was colder here, enough to make my breath fog up. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. My footsteps echoed as I made my way deeper inside, the floorboards creaking with each step. The place was huge, much bigger than it looked from the outside. Doorways branched off on either side of the hallway, leading to rooms filled with old furniture draped in dusty sheets. Cobwebs hung from the corners like veils, swaying slightly as I passed. I turned a corner and nearly tripped over something lying on the floor. Shining my flashlight down, I saw it was a wheelchair, old and rusted, one wheel bent at an awkward angle. For some reason, the sight of it made my skin crawl. I stepped around it carefully and kept moving. The hallway opened up into a large room that must have been the funeral home's main parlor. Rows of wooden chairs sat facing a small stage where a dusty podium stood. Heavy velvet curtains hung from the windows, blocking out what little moonlight there was. In the center of the room stood a casket, closed, its polished surface gleaming faintly in the flashlight beam. I froze. Something about that casket felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the sight of it made my chest tighten, like I just stepped into a room where I wasn't supposed to be. My legs refused to move, caught between the urge to run and the morbid curiosity to see what was inside. Then I heard it, a faint creak, like a door opening somewhere behind me. I whipped around, shining my flashlight down the hallway I'd just come from. Nothing, just the empty corridor stretching into the dark. "Hello?" My voice cracked, echoing off the walls. No response. I turned back to the casket, my heart pounding in my ears. For a moment, I thought I saw it move, a tiny shift, barely noticeable, like something inside had stirred. I stepped back, nearly tripping over one of the chairs. My breath came in shallow gasps, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Then the sound came again, louder this time. Not a creak, but a low, guttural groan, like wood bending under pressure. It came from behind me, closer now. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting wildly. And that's when I saw it. A shadow. Not a person or an object, but a shadow. Long, thin, and impossibly dark, stretching across the wall even though there was nothing to cast it. It flickered for a moment, then darted out of sight, disappearing down the hallway. I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of what I'd just seen. My legs finally listened, and I backed away, my eyes darting between the casket and the hallway. Every instinct screamed at me to get out. But before I could move, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. And then the lights went out. I stood there in the pitch black, my heart slamming against my ribs. My flashlight was still on, but the beam felt pathetically small against the endless darkness swallowing the room. The door behind me, the one I swore had been open just a moment ago, was now shut tight. I could still hear the echo of it slamming, like the house was mocking me. I aimed the flashlight back toward the casket, half expecting it to have moved, or worse, to be wide open. But it hadn't budged. It sat there like a dead thing in the center of the room, daring me to come closer. My stomach churned. "Okay," I whispered to myself. "You're tired. You're freaking yourself out. Just get out of here." But as I turned toward the door, something stopped me. A sound. It started soft, almost imperceptible, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against fabric. Then it grew louder, deeper, like the slow intake of breath. It was coming from the walls. No, not the walls. The house itself. It was breathing. I swung the flashlight beam wildly across the room, searching for the source of the noise, but there was nothing. Just the empty chairs, the curtains swaying slightly even though there was no breeze, and that casket sitting there like it owned the place. "Hello," I called out again, my voice barely above a whisper. It felt stupid now, pointless. Whatever was here wasn't going to answer me. The breathing sound stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt even worse. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take a step toward the door. My boots scuffed against the floor, and that tiny sound was enough to send a shiver crawling up my spine. Every muscle in my body was tense, like I was waiting for something to pounce. When I reached the door, I grabbed the handle and yanked. It didn't budge. I tried again, harder this time, throwing my weight into it. Nothing. It was like the door had been welded shut. Panic bubbled up in my chest, and I fought the urge to start pounding on it like a lunatic. "Let me out," I shouted, my voice cracking. No response. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, and then, just as I was about to start screaming, I heard it again, that low, groaning creak. This time, it wasn't coming from behind me, it was coming from above. I tilted the flashlight upward, and my breath caught in my throat. The ceiling was moving. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, shadows shifting in the beam of my flashlight. But no, it was moving. Slowly, steadily, the plaster seemed to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a single drop of water. And then it began to bulge downward, like something on the other side was pushing against it. I stumbled back, my legs hitting one of the chairs and nearly sending me sprawling to the floor. My flashlight shook in my hand as the bulge grew larger, more defined. I could see the outline of something pressing against the ceiling, its shape long and angular, like an arm or a leg. The breathing sound returned, louder now, coming in slow, rhythmic bursts that made my skin crawl. And then it stopped. The bulge receded, melting back into the ceiling like it had never been there. The house was silent again, but it didn't feel empty. If anything, it felt more alive than ever, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it wanted. I bolted down the hallway, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my grip. Every door I passed seemed wrong, like they were leaning toward me, their frames warped and uneven. The pictures on the walls were clearer now, the faces no longer blurred. They stared at me with wide, empty eyes, their mouths twisted into silent screams. "Don't look," I muttered to myself, focusing on the end of the hallway where a faint sliver of moonlight peeked through a cracked window. If I could just get there, maybe I could find a way out. The sound of footsteps stopped me dead in my tracks. They weren't mine. They were heavy, deliberate, and coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the dark, but there was nothing there, just the hallway stretching endlessly into shadow. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but I couldn't see anything. It was like whatever was making the sound was walking just outside the beam of my flashlight. My knees felt like they were about to give out, but I forced myself to move. I ran toward the window, not daring to look back. The footsteps followed me, their pace quickening to match mine. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest tightening with every step. When I reached the window, I grabbed the frame and pulled, desperate to open it. The wood groaned under my hands, but it wouldn't budge. "Come on!" I shouted, yanking harder. The footsteps stopped. I froze, my hands still gripping the window frame. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me like a weight. Slowly, I turned my head, the flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the hallway. It stood at the far end. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It was blacker than the shadows around it, like it absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. Its arms hung limply at its sides, the fingers stretched unnaturally long, almost brushing the floor. I couldn't see its face. Or maybe it didn't have one. For a moment, neither of us moved. My mind screamed at me to do something, run, scream anything, but my body refused to listen. The thing tilted its head further, the motion slow and deliberate, like it was studying me. And then it started walking. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one sending a shiver down my spine. I scrambled away from the window, my flashlight fixed on the figure as it moved closer. Its arms swung slightly with each step, its body swaying unnaturally, like a marionette on strings. I backed into the wall, my legs shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. The thing stopped a few feet away, its towering form looming over me. The air around it felt cold, heavy, like it was sucking all the oxygen out of the room. And then it bent down, its featureless face mere inches from mine. A sound filled the air, low and guttural, like a growl mixed with static. My vision blurred, my head pounding with pain as the sound grew louder, filling every corner of the house. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. It wasn't just in my ears, it was in my head, burrowing deep into my skull like a drill. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor and spinning wildly. For a brief moment, the beam caught the figure's face, or what should have been its face. There was nothing there, just a void, endless and empty. And then everything went black. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the cold. It wasn't the kind of cold you'd feel on a winter night. It was deeper than that. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you're drowning in ice. My skin prickled, every hair standing on end. My head throbbed like I'd been hit with a sledgehammer, and it took a moment for my thoughts to catch up to my body. The second thing I noticed was the dark. My flashlight was gone, so was my backpack. I sat up slowly, the hard, uneven floor creaking beneath me. The air was thick, damp, and reeked of mildew. A faint, rhythmic sound echoed around me. Drip, 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 like water falling somewhere in the distance. I reached out blindly, my fingers brushing against splintered wood. A chair? No, a pew. It felt like one of those old church pews, its surface rough and pockmarked with age. Where the hell was I? My memory came rushing back in fragments. The funeral home, the casket, that thing. My stomach churned as the image of its empty, void-like face flashed in my mind. I tried to stand, but my legs wobbled beneath me, and I had to brace myself against the pew to keep from collapsing. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, the air too thick to fill my lungs. "Hello?" My voice echoed, small and hollow in the endless dark. There was no response, just the drip, drip, drip. I forced myself to move, sliding my hands along the edge of the pew as I stumbled forward. My eyes started to adjust, picking up faint outlines in the gloom. I was in a large room, larger than any I'd seen in the funeral home before. The ceiling arched high above me, lost in shadow, and rows of pews stretched out on either side. At the far end of the room, a faint light glowed, casting long, flickering shadows across the floor. The light was coming from a doorway, an open doorway. I didn't want to go toward it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, to find another way out. But there was nowhere else to go. The dark behind me felt alive, pressing against my back like a predator waiting for me to make the wrong move. So I staggered toward the doorway, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, illuminating the doorway's frame. It wasn't like normal light. It was pale, almost sickly, and it flickered like a dying bulb. The air around it shimmered, warping like heat rising off asphalt. When I reached the doorway, I stopped. The room beyond wasn't a room. It was wrong. The walls were warped, curving inward like the ribs of some massive beast. The floor was uneven, sloping downward toward the center of the room, where a hole gaped like a black maw. The light wasn't coming from a bulb or a lamp, but from the walls themselves, which seemed to pulse faintly, as though they were alive. Thick, dark liquid oozed from the cracks in the walls, dripping down to pool around the edges of the hole. The smell was overpowering, metallic and rotten, like blood mixed with decay. I should have turned back. I should have run. But something pulled me forward. Not physically. I wasn't being dragged or pushed. It was more like a compulsion, a voice in the back of my mind whispering that I needed to see what was in that hole, that I needed to understand. My feet moved on their own, carrying me down the sloping floor toward the center of the room. As I got closer, the air grew colder, biting at my skin like tiny needles. The dripping sound grew louder, echoing off the walls, mixing with a low, guttural hum that I could feel vibrating in my chest. When I reached the edge of the hole, I peered down. It wasn't a hole, it was a mirror. No, not quite a mirror. The surface was reflective, but it wasn't showing me. It was showing something else, someone else. A woman stood in the reflection, her back to me. Her hair was long and dark, matted with dirt, and she wore a tattered black dress that clung to her thin frame. She was barefoot, her pale, emaciated feet smeared with something dark. Blood? "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, perfectly still, staring at something I couldn't see. My reflection wasn't there, just hers. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the surface of the mirror. "Can you hear me?" Her head snapped around. I stumbled back, nearly falling as my heart leapt into my throat. Her face. God, her face. Her eyes were sunken, her skin stretched tight over her skull like she hadn't eaten in weeks. Her mouth was sewn shut with thick, black thread, the skin around the stitches raw and red. But her eyes burned with something I couldn't describe. Anger, fear, hunger. She stared at me, unblinking, her chest heaving with ragged breaths, and then slowly she raised one hand and pointed behind me. I froze. The air behind me felt different, heavier, colder. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what she was pointing at. But I couldn't stop myself. My body moved on its own, my head twisting painfully slow as I turned to look. The doorway was gone. In its place was the thing from before. It was closer now, much closer, its impossibly long limbs folded awkwardly like a spider. It crouched low, its head tilted to one side as it stared at me with that featureless void of a face. The room seemed to shrink around it, the walls pressing inward, the air growing so cold I could see my breath. It didn't move, it just watched me. "What do you want?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The thing straightened slowly, its limbs creaking like old wood. The sound made my stomach turn, like nails scraping against bone. And then it did something that made my blood run cold. It raised its hand, one long, spindly finger, and pointed at the hole. "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, I'm not." The floor shifted beneath me, tilting sharply toward the hole. I tried to scramble back, but the slope was too steep and I slid forward, the rough surface tearing at my hands and knees. The thing didn't follow me. It just stood there, watching as I was dragged toward the gaping maw in the floor. When I reached the edge, I grabbed onto the uneven surface, my fingers scrabbling for a grip. The reflective surface of the hole shimmered beneath me, the woman's face staring up at me with those burning eyes. "Help me!" I shouted, not sure if I was yelling at her, the thing, or whatever God might be listening. The woman's sewn mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. And then she whispered a single word, so faint I wasn't sure if I'd heard it or imagined it. Stay. The surface of the hole shattered like glass, and I fell. Falling felt like it should have lasted forever, but it didn't. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of my lungs as I slammed into something cold and wet. For a few seconds, I just lay there, gasping for breath, my body aching from the impact. The ground beneath me wasn't solid. It shifted under my weight, soft and squelching, like packed mud soaked through with water. The smell hit me next. It was rancid, a sickly sweet mix of rot and decay that made my stomach heave. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it was gone. My hands scrambled through the muck, coming up empty. Panic clawed at my throat as I realized how dark it was, pitch black, the kind of dark that swallowed everything whole. I couldn't even see my own hands in front of my face. That's when I heard it. A low, wet squelching sound, like something moving through the muck. It was faint at first, distant, but it grew louder with each passing second. My heart raced as I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice weak and shaky. The sound stopped, silence, then a whisper, faint and barely audible, brushing against my ear like a cold breath. "Why did you come here?" I spun around, my arms flailing in the dark. "Who's there?" No answer, just the wet, sucking noise of something moving through the darkness again. It was closer now, circling me. I could feel it, the weight of its presence, the way the air grew colder around it. My eyes started to adjust, picking up faint shapes in the gloom. The ground wasn't just mud, it was littered with things, bones. Dozens of them, some small and splintered, others long and intact, their jagged edges sticking up like broken glass. My foot caught on something, and I stumbled, nearly falling. When I looked down, I saw what had tripped me, a skull, human. Its hollow eyes stared up at me, its jaw hanging open in a silent scream. I staggered back, my breathing ragged, and that's when I realized there wasn't just one skull. They were everywhere, half buried in the muck, their yellowed surfaces gleaming faintly in the dim, unnatural light that seemed to seep up from the ground itself. I had to get out of here. I turned, searching for anything, a door, a tunnel, a way out, but all I saw was darkness stretching endlessly in every direction. The wet sound of movement grew louder, coming from all around me now. I couldn't tell where it was coming from or how many of them there were. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, shifting at the edge of my vision. But as it moved closer, it took shape, a massive hulking figure, its body twisted and unnatural. Its limbs were too long, its torso too narrow, its head lolling to one side like it didn't have the strength to hold itself up. It walked on all fours, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with its strings tangled. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void. Not blank like the figure upstairs, but an actual void, a gaping hole where its head should have been, ringed with jagged, blackened teeth that dripped with thick, dark fluid. It stopped a few feet away, its head tilting as if it were studying me. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were encased in concrete, my breath caught in my throat. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with thoughts, invading my mind like a parasite. Its voice was low and guttural, echoing inside my skull. "They brought you here, just like the others." I shook my head, my voice trembling. "I don't understand. Who brought me here?" The creature didn't respond, but its head tilted further, the jagged teeth clicking together like chattering bones. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of what I'd seen. The funeral home, the photos, the woman in the mirror, the disappearances. The others, the missing people, I whispered. "They came here, didn't they?" The creature let out a low, rumbling sound that might have been a laugh. The shadows around it writhed and twisted, shapes forming and dissolving like smoke. "They feed us," it said. "Their fear, their pain, their despair. We take it, and they are ours." I stumbled back, my foot catching on another bone. No, you're lying. This can't be real. This was just supposed to be." "An escape?" the creature hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "There is no escape. Not from this place." The ground shifted beneath me, the mud sucking at my boots like it wanted to pull me under. The whispers returned, louder now, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Stay," they said. "Stay with us." I tried to run, but the ground was too slick, too unstable. I slipped and fell, my hands sinking into the muck. Something brushed against my fingers, soft and fleshy, and I recoiled, my stomach turning as I realized what it was. A hand. a severed human hand, half buried in the mud. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were a deafening roar. Shapes began to emerge from the shadows, dozens of them, their bodies twisted and broken, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Some crawled on all fours, their limbs bent at impossible angles, while others shuffled upright, their heads lolling like rag dolls. They were the missing people, or what was left of them. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Please," I begged. "I didn't mean to. Just let me go. I don't want to be here." The hulking creature leaned closer, its void-like face inches from mine. I could feel its breath, cold and damp, against my skin. "You were chosen," it said. "You belong to us now." I screamed as the ground beneath me gave way, and I was pulled under. I didn't fall this time. I sank. The mud swallowed me, cold and suffocating, pulling me deeper into the earth. I clawed at the darkness, gasping for air, but there was no light, no sound, just the crushing weight of whatever this place was. My body felt heavy, like the mud wasn't just around me, but inside me, seeping into my lungs, my veins, my thoughts. And then, suddenly, it was gone. I was lying on something hard and cold. My hands touched smooth wood, polished and seamless. I opened my eyes, coughing and gasping, and found myself staring up at a familiar ceiling. A low, plaster ceiling with cracks, spiderwebbing across its surface. The smell of mildew and rot clung to the air. I sat up slowly, my body aching, and realized where I was. The parlor. The same room I'd seen when I first entered the funeral home. The rows of chairs were still there, facing the small stage. The velvet curtains still hung limp over the windows. And in the center of the room, gleaming faintly in the dim light, was the casket. Only now, it wasn't closed. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The lid was open, tilted back, revealing the dark interior. I couldn't see inside, but I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to get up, to run, but my body wouldn't move. Something moved inside the casket. It was subtle, just the faintest ripple of motion, like a hand brushing against fabric. My stomach twisted as a low guttural sound filled the room, a groan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then, slowly, a figure began to rise. It was the woman from the mirror. Her long, dark hair hung limp around her face, matted with mud and blood. Her black dress clung to her emaciated frame, torn and ragged, revealing pale, bruised skin stretched tight over bone. Her hands gripped the edges of the casket, the skin raw and blistered, the nails cracked and broken. But it was her face that made my blood run cold. Her mouth was no longer sewn shut. The black threads dangled loosely from her lips, and her mouth hung open, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. Her eyes burned with that same unnatural fire, locked onto mine as she pulled herself upright. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice a low, guttural rasp. I scrambled back, my hands and feet slipping on the slick floor. "I didn't mean to. I was just looking for help." Her head tilted, her movements slow and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. "Help?" she hissed. "There is no help. Not here." The room began to change around me. The walls stretched and warped, the wallpaper peeling away to reveal something dark and pulsating beneath. The chairs dissolved into shadow, and the ceiling cracked open like rotting wood, revealing a swirling void above. The air grew thick with the smell of blood and decay, and the groaning sound returned, louder now, shaking the floor beneath me. "You don't understand," the woman said, stepping out of the casket. Her bare feet left dark, wet stains on the floor as she approached me. "This place, it feeds, it takes what it wants, and it never lets go." "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice breaking. She knelt in front of me, her burning eyes boring into mine. "It's not what I want, it's what they want." Before I could respond, the floor beneath me gave way, and I fell again, this time into a world of fire and shadow. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the funeral home. I was outside, standing at the edge of a wide, desolate field. The ground was barren and cracked, stretching endlessly in every direction. The sky was black, but not like night. It was a suffocating, empty blackness devoid of stars or a moon. A faint, flickering light glowed in the distance, and I felt myself drawn toward it, my feet moving without my consent. As I walked, the air grew colder, and I began to see shapes in the gloom. At first, they were just shadows, indistinct and wavering. But as I got closer, they took form. People. They stood in rows, motionless, their heads bowed. Their bodies were thin, emaciated, their skin pale and stretched tight over their bones. Some were missing limbs, others had their faces twisted into grotesque shapes, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Their eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to follow me as I passed. And then I realized they weren't just standing there, they were buried. Their feet were fused to the ground, their legs sinking into the cracked earth as though they'd been swallowed by it. The further I walked, the more there were, hundreds, maybe thousands, stretching out into the horizon. The light grew brighter, and I finally saw its source. The casket. It stood in the center of the field, impossibly large, its surface gleaming like polished obsidian. The air around it shimmered, distorting like heat waves, and standing next to it was the woman, her mouth twisted into a cruel smile as she gestured toward the casket. "This is where it ends," she said. I shook my head, backing away. No, I'm not going in there." Her smile widened, and the ground beneath me shifted. Hands burst from the earth, clawing at my legs, pulling me down. I screamed, thrashing and kicking, but there were too many. Their fingers dug into my skin, their hollow eyes staring up at me with a desperate, hungry intensity. "You don't have a choice," the woman said, her voice echoing like thunder. The hands dragged me toward the casket, the ground splitting open beneath me. The last thing I saw before I was swallowed whole was the woman's burning eyes, and the last thing I heard was her voice, low and triumphant. "You belong to us now." They found my car 3 days later, abandoned on the side of the road. The engine was dead, and my phone was still sitting in the passenger seat. The police searched the area but found no sign of me or anyone else. The funeral home was empty when they checked it, its doors locked tight, its windows boarded up. They said it had been closed for decades, condemned after the owner disappeared under mysterious circumstances. But I know the truth. I'm still here. Somewhere in the dark, in the mud, in the endless void beneath Hollow Pines Funeral Home. I'm still here, and I'm not alone. Thank you for tuning into my story. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to like the video. It helps support my channel and allows me to keep creating more content for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to comment below and share your favorite part of the story or any theories you might have. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. Your support means the world to me. And I'm excited to bring you even more thrilling stories.